Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are having a good time here. Today, we are honored to have among us Dr. K.K. Sinha as the first keynote speaker of the conference. I request Professor Sriram Narayanan to introduce Dr. K.K. Sinha.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's actually my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Sinha. And, this is the second time we are doing a conference. I'm associated with the conference at SP Jain. The first one we did was the PALMS India Chapter Conference. And incidentally, Professor Sinha was a keynote speaker in that conference as well. So it's a pleasure to have him back here. Professor Sinha is a professor and chair of supply chain and operations management and is the holder of the Mosaic Company Jim Prokopanko Professorship in Corporate Responsibility at the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota. He also serves as a graduate faculty in bioinformatics and computational biology. His scholarly interests lie at the intersection of the disciplines of management and public policy and topics of technology and innovation, healthcare, global supply chains, quality, and social responsibility. His inquiries are predominantly empirical, motivated by contemporary and consequential real-world business and societal problems, and conducted typically in partnership with firms and not-for-profit organizations. He has published papers in top-tier academic journals and is the recipient of a number of scholarly recognitions. More recently, he was the recipient of 2016 University of Minnesota Grand Challenge Grant, and in 2017, he was recognized as the MS in Supply Chain Management Teacher of the Year at Carlson School of Management. On a very personal note, even as doctoral students, we have grown up reading KK's papers, and many of them, so it's a pleasure to welcome him. Professor Sinha, the floor is all yours. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening. That was a very kind introduction, Sriram. The thing to note is, if you're in need of a guest speaker, you can call me. So that's another way to think about it. I'm always available. So if you read between the lines, I think that's what Sriram meant. So, all right. With that, I'm truly honored, and it's been a real privilege to be here. And I would take this moment to first acknowledge somebody I had known because he visited me. And so this place means something very special to me, and that is Dr. Manish Shrikant, who was a dean here for almost 3 decades. And he visited me while I was a young faculty, and visited me twice. I don't know why he visited me, but he did. And so that was my introduction to SP Jain. So SP Jain has always had a special place in my heart. And then that was further enhanced by the fact that we have the Ranjan Banerjee, who I've known as a doctoral student while he was working on PhD, and he was in marketing, I was in supply chain. That didn't stop us from talking to one another. So once again, it's those reasons that make SP Jain a very special place. I also want to acknowledge our DSI colleagues for the wonderful job. This is a 12 years in running, and I couldn't be more grateful for the work that Jeet and Sriram and many of you are doing that I don't even know. And because DSI and Minnesota has, again, a very strong connection over the years, and I understand next year is the 50th year, so thank you for everything you're doing in terms of, this is tough work, and I would really take a moment to give them a round of applause. So thank you, Jeet, and all of you who do this, because it's a non-trivial and sometimes one could view as a thankless job. And I'm truly grateful. What I have here today is kind of a lofty title, but believe me, by no means do I consider this as a bumper sticker. A grand challenge has a specific meaning, perhaps it's a broad enough of an umbrella that can inspire us, motivate us. It has, for me, to almost given a shot in the arm. And I thought, since Sriram already told I've been here once, maybe I have to say something which is new and different, so I'm making this up. No. Things did happen, and so the title was intended to give almost a forward-looking perspective in terms of what we in the field can be doing or are already doing, and perhaps the way we can think and reorganize ourselves. And there are some interesting opportunities to that end. So this is sort of the roadmap for my remarks. I mean, I would like to take a few moments to introduce this idea of grand challenges, because it's got a buzz, and it has got a little bit of what I call a shelf life, an enduring power, which I think does certainly inspire me. I can speak for my department, for the school, and certainly for the university. So that's where I'm coming from. I would like to personalize it by using Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, although these are not contrasting tales, but they are grounded in terms of some of the work I've been doing with my colleagues. And I would like to anchor some of my remarks, not so much about as a research seminar, but more about what went into these journeys and how these journeys are coming along. So it's more of a reflection as to how we think about these things going forward. And by no means this is the last word, and I would love to use this as an opportunity for you to also share your journeys, hopefully, and that, I think, will make the conversation somewhat interesting and perhaps even inspiring. And then what does it mean for us? What are some of the keys, the so what question, the takeaways, and the implications? So let me begin with this idea, what is a grand challenge? And and it obviously, it's a loosely and a casually used term, but in the parlance right now, for a lot of research universities, it has a connotation of what is typically known as a moonshot. I mean, and moonshot typically gets associated with John F. Kennedy, and let's go to the moon, right? Setting up some lofty goals and aspirational goals is powerful in its own right, as long as it helps to organize and gets the best out of us, rallies us together so that we can move ahead, notwithstanding the challenges and the reality. So this is not about the romanticism of grand challenge. This is about the reality that I would like to talk to you about, because that, I would submit to you, has what has enthused and excited me, and making it a believer in this, okay? And it's sufficiently large of an umbrella that it can, or a tent, that we can really find ourselves what motivates us. So it's really something aspirational that we can adapt in our own ways. Simply put, these ambitious goals, and more importantly, it has a way to engage people, engage not just us in academia, in our disciplines, but across sectors. We can start thinking in terms of even capturing the imagination of even the people and the public, all towards an end of innovation, addressing some questions that we are all faced with and probably should be tackling, because in some sense we are in a unique position to do so. They're almost like North Stars that guides us, and most important thing is in a multidisciplinary sense. It can also become a mechanism for how we strategize, how we organize our innovations, cutting across university boundaries, country boundaries, and so sort of a catalytic sort of effect for this grand challenge. And that's really what it did. And so in some sense, the question that I want to each one of you to start thinking, and I want to engage you, is what is your moonshot? In our own humble ways, what is the difference that we would like to make, that we can look back and say, yes, it was all worth it? Not that I'm a fan of Obama, but I would have to acknowledge that President Obama did help to give a new life to the idea of grand challenges back in about 2013. And that's roughly 5+ years ago. And I can tell you that I think it had a ring to it. It had a way to engage the private and the public sector together, along with the philanthropists and all of that coming together. I think we can see a beginning of people coming together towards some goals and ends. And from my point of view, I literally was pulled out from our president/provost office to say, hey, you got to serve on this group, okay? And that's how I got involved. It was not by plan. It was almost by fiat. Your president, your provost calls you, wants to serve. So 5 years have gone by. And this is why I, notwithstanding my own interest and my own enthusiasm, I thought I shared with you that there was an interesting article just not that long ago in Scientific American, which really took a stock of what has happened, right? What has happened since so-called the call to action back in 2013. And there is at least 20 different universities who seem to have put a stake in the ground in their own ways. I mean, they are not by any means what I would call copycats of one another. There may be some overlaps. And you can clearly see University of Minnesota, and I can speak to our leadership of the university. They took it sincerely. We being a public university, meaning our state supports our budget, and we have a land grant mission. That means essentially we cater to the needs of the state. I think this becomes something very real, and it has rallied people across campus and across discipline, and certainly I found myself very energized by that. So just to give you a sense of, there are 5 grand challenges that University of Minnesota acknowledged. Nothing is unique here. You can clearly see the issues of health is very significant, salient here. Issues of equitable community, equity in communities and society, I think is a primary objective. Acknowledging the potential of individuals and communities is another sort of an aspirational goal that was set forth. Then securing the food and security, the water and energy, and also sustainable communities. So these are the kind of the questions that essentially rallied our institution, and the state got behind it as well. Okay? So besides all that, my view that I'm going to share with you is something very personal. When I say personal, both in terms of what I have been involved with and our group has been involved with. And I would also highlight the 2 tales that I'm going to talk to you about is really at the intersection of health and this idea of equitable societies. Okay? So the whole idea of healthcare disparity. I mean, why should there be structural deficit in the supply and demand equation for healthcare? Why is it that somebody who lives outside, say, one of the major hospitals in town, say Bombay, cannot have access to that healthcare? Why in some part of the world that person can, it doesn't matter, but in some places you cannot. I mean, the rest of the world can come to your hospital, get the care, but you live right outside the walls of the hospital, you cannot access care. So, and again, this might sound crass, but this is a reality. And the question is, these disparities are not becoming less, it's only growing. Okay, and that is something I can empirically attest to. So my objective is to share with you, in all humility, really 2 tales. And also give you a sense of where we are going. This is truly a journey. By no means we are anywhere close to the destination. I don't anticipate this is a lifetime's work, but it's something that does, inspire and energize. So the first piece of work of this is really grounded in a paper that I'm just sharing with you, and the sort of the title speaks for itself. I mean, it talks about the idea of how do we deliver long-term surgical care in underserved communities. And the subtitle is an acknowledgement of the role of not-for-profit organizations. There's a reason why surgical care appealed to me in person, because this is where our proverbial people process technology comes together. It's one thing to pop pills in Sub-Sahara, in South Africa, when you have HIV, AIDS, and malaria, and one of these. It's another thing to have the setup where you can perform a complex surgery. And yes, we have the Arvind eye cams, and we have the Narayan Hridalayas. So this is in that genre to say, can we push this to the fact that we can provide surgical care in places that doesn't have it, and how can we systematically think about it? So my partners here were two of the former doctoral students, Emily Conke, who is currently at Iowa State, and Ujjwal Mukherjee, who is at Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And there are different reasons. So this line of work, by definition, is like a team sport. We all have to play and man different posts if we want to be effective in this quote-unquote effort. And I'm being very fortunate to have colleagues and students who have chosen to pursue this line of work. So the question really is sort of a simple question, but not a question that one typically asks, because the last time, when you think of not-for-profit operations and surgical care, especially complex surgery, not just simple eye cams and things that are relatively more easily executable, is these are almost like oxymoron. They don't necessarily go together. Yet, I think there is an acknowledgement that they have a role to play, and the conviction that I gathered almost through due diligence is that indeed is the case. At least there is enough anecdotal evidence to that effect that these not-for-operations or organizations have been effective and on a sustained level. So there are a few things that probably is worthwhile, that the gap for the demand and the supply of surgical care in underserved communities is widening. And this is not just true in what I would call developing. This is happening in the US. Hospitals are shutting down, and lots of places. Hospital shutdown is a common phenomenon, which basically means that the surgical care facility is being taken out. And so that reduces the supply side, besides the shortage of surgeons and a whole bunch of other things. Now, I'm not going to get into why it's happening, but that's the reality. That's an empirical reality, that's happening. And so the question is, this is not a problem that of, one would say, just underdeveloped countries or developing economy. This is as much true in developed countries as well. The drivers may be different, but the phenomenon is a very true and a real phenomenon. So one thing that I think we cannot dodge, and that's something we will see, that I'm not a physician, and I do not, but what we do understand are issues of scale. We do understand the issues of sustainability, what makes things resilient. And we have some sense through observation to see when supply and demand is out of whack, because that's why we exist in supply chain. However, the rationale for why this is happening is perhaps not one and the same in every community. So the whole idea here is, can we roll up our sleeves and begin to understand why this is happening? And what can be solutions to it. So if we knew what we knew, we have made huge strides in modern medicine. Schools of public health have existed, all kinds of facilities. Yet, somehow, even if you come with the best care, if the care is not available, what good is it, right? So, and that is effectively what's driving part of what we are thinking through, is to say, how can we design the care right the first time, where care itself is a bundle of goods and services. We can think in terms of take care as the bundle. You can start thinking of diet and exercise. You can think of drugs. You can think of medical devices. You can take invasive procedures. You can think of, the new biologics, the, stem cells. And then we cannot ignore the fact that somebody has to pay for it, just like when you buy a car. And then the logistics, whether it's, you call it medical tourism or destination, Mayo Clinic. The idea is still the same, which is basically people either have to go to the care facility or the care facility has to come to the person, right? And so that's something is up our bailiwick. We understand that, we do it. And so that at least certainly was one of my own incentives to say, okay, this might be worth looking at. So the particular disease context that I'm going to share with you in healthcare, I think to be effective, I think it is somewhat important to have a context in mind. And the disease context here is congenital heart disease, which is one of the common form or reasons for child mortality in lots of parts of the world. And you can clearly see the location, the general location is that of China. And there is no reason why I picked China other than the fact that it was an access issue that we found people are willing to collaborate, and that's why we ended up being there. The statistics is all going in the wrong direction. You would like to believe that over time, if we make progress, then congenital heart disease should be something we should be able to take care of. Yet, the facts don't quite stack up that way. The specific location that we are looking at is the Gansu province in China. It's not one of the well-known states. In fact, it's one of the most impoverished, second most impoverished state in China. It also, coincidentally, it's one of those places which has a very high rate or high incidence of kids being born with congenital heart disease, which, if the kid was born in many parts of the world, would be very much curable, treatable. Yes, surgery was needed, but it was hugely treatable. So even within the context of China, I think, and that's why we had some support from the Chinese government, is the fact that this is 6 times more than China's national average. This continues to be a major issue, one of the major reasons of child mortality. So people have think about grand challenges where US aid views this as one of the top grand challenges. Okay, so what we did in this particular case, as we started trying to understand who are and how they are being effective in terms of delivery of such care, this is the organization that we have been partnering with. It's a not-for-profit operations. They have been around for 30 years in the Twin Cities. This is what they do in some sense. They do sourcing of funds, get the funds, get the best and the brightest doctors. These are, when I say the medical volunteers, these are surgeons from Mayo Clinic, Mass General, Stanford. People are willing to volunteer their time. Same thing true with the nurses, the technicians, the biomed guys. And then they also source the equipment. So you can imagine this is whole people process technology coming together and moving it to a part of the world which is where they adopt a hospital. In this case, first Lanzhou Hospital in China, to make sure that they can up their capability. So when these people eventually leave, that hospital can continue to perform the work. All right. So one of the things for us, what became interesting is, again, we don't necessarily think about the role of community and what the community can do for you, both in terms of sensing and responding to the demand. This became a very interesting kind of a lens in trying to understand how these not-for-profit organizations work. Because generally they are there in these settings long before any for-profit organization goes. So they understand the lay of the land, they understand the needs of the people, they're probably on the best gauge to understand what the preferences, the indigenous needs are. So this is what looked like, in the setting. And the key thing to note here is that this hospital was adopted in 1999. It has come a long way. What's been most gratifying is some of the impact even some of our work has had in delivering care to that part of the world. It has seen a steady increase in patient volumes with increasing what I call surgical complexity. In fact, last year, they were able to perform, the Chinese doctors, surgeons were able to perform congenital heart disease surgery on preemies, the prematurely born kids. And that was a huge accomplishment. And along the way, it has also trained a generation of physicians in that part of the country. Okay. So what does it mean for us? So when if I were to reflect, how did we do what we did? This is not a case where data is available, nor do we understand much of the context. So a lot of the things was like landing up in an island and almost like an anthropologist and trying to understand. And this is typically now is becoming quite common, even though we have the analytical training. This grounded theory method is a very simple, but a very effective, and I would say very tedious way trying to understand the lay of the land. And that's basically what we were doing. This is a context of where the data is necessarily small, there's not much. The data is dirty. That means it's fraught with all kinds of measurement error. And it's sparse. It's a lot of zeros, right? That's sort of the context or the methodological challenge within which we had to work. And what was inspiring is that, when you're faced with this challenge, you say, this problem is real. We cannot abandon the problem because we don't know the methods are not there or the data is not there. You get sufficiently driven to say, let's figure out if we can develop something on our own. So it's very, very problem driven, and some of the approaches that we have come up with is really a very grounds up approach. And then once you have enough, then you can start looking at some of the standard empirical research methods. So very simply, you can clearly see what do we do? What we did was essentially trying to say, can we begin to understand what drives the demand for care? And in some sense, at an intuitive level, it's not that very difficult. Demand for care is a function of affordability, access, and awareness. You can think of provider, patient affordability, access, and awareness. We all know this. It's a fairly, it's not that difficult of an issue to. I think the issue that one is faced with is to see how do these things interact? What are their interdependencies? So if you are, whether it's a government or a not-for-profit operations, you're going out there and you want to have limited resources and you want to prioritize your effort, is there some insights that we can provide that allows us to make some sense of, say, okay, where do we allocate? Are there some aha factors? Are there some counterintuitive? That's really what we were trying to understand in the first place. So there's a lot of, as I said, there was a lot of effort in this because the focus of this conference, data is a big part, data-driven. But the reality is sometimes, as I said, data is not necessarily as much as you would want. It's not as easily accessible. It's not necessarily clean. And it's sparse, okay? So there are some of the steps that we went through, but more importantly, we went through, a whole bunch of analysis, but I think the main thing is that this whole idea of iterative processes, and thankfully we have methods and approaches right now that allow us to begin to understand what is the best we can do with the data we have, rather than saying we cannot abandon it. So the question is, what's the best we can do with what we have? And that's really is what you are seeing we are trying to accomplish. So we did come up with something which we thought was at least a good place to begin, is to say how do we, these efforts should be interrelate with one another, and how in turn that affects our surgical care delivery. Right? So that's basically one way to think about it, is to say we all care about surgical care delivery, we care about the volume, we want to increase because the demand far exceeds the supply, we want to ensure quality. In other words, we can control for quality, we can control for the difficulty in the surgery. But at the end of the day, what's interesting and counterintuitive is the fact that we got to realize how critical is the role of awareness. And when I say awareness, it's provider awareness and patient awareness, right? If you don't know what you don't know, you'll never seek something, even if you are given care on a platter. That's effectively what was going on. What was going on is Children's Heart Sling gets all these people who are the best of the best, go out there are no takers, simply because there isn't that awareness. And again, once we say it becomes very intuitive, yet for the context that we are talking of, it's real, and to be able to then demonstrate it, I think allowed both us and the organizations to help prioritize how you allocate your resources. And to take the focus out of affordability, because a lot of times say, if you drive down the cost, it makes things affordable, we will see the demand. That only makes sense if and only if we know that I, as a parent, sitting in a far-flung village, my kid gets diagnosed with a congenital heart disease, I'm willing to put my kid for surgery. I don't know who these guys are, but somebody says, am I willing to do this? Am I willing? And that's the barrier we have crossed. Okay, so we were able to establish some of these relationships. And again, there's a lot more to this. But this is a very simple yet an informative insight within the context of what we are doing, starting from where we did with very little and then coming up with some interesting, or what I would call. And there's a whole bunch of other things that I'm going to do. So in terms of so what in this particular case, clearly we have at least the beginnings of an approach that I would say that we can bring to bear in these kinds of contexts, which is very typical in a lot of the underserved communities, because people are not out there collecting data. The purpose is, the needs are very basic, yet without data, you cannot necessarily address those questions. And so we need to be mindful. This takes away the romanticism of grand challenges. You got to get the reality. And then, this has helped a lot of NPOs, and not just this one organization, but a whole cadre of organization in terms of who perform this kind of work. Okay, just to give you fast forward, what are we doing now? So this was like a stepping stone for what we are doing now. What we are doing now, it could be deemed, is in India. Same organization, 2 different states. The tale of 2 states in India, as you can clearly see. One is Kerala, the other is West Bengal. The reality is that things are has unfolded in quite different ways. In West Bengal, things are very bottoms up. There is Rabindranath Institute of Cardiac Sciences, where Devi Shetty first started his foray when Mother Teresa invited him. And he's been this organization is where now Children Heartling is partnering, and that has spillovers to Howrah, and so they are reaching out, but in a very organic, bottoms-up approach. On the other hand, what's happening in Kerala is a very well-orchestrated, government is doing stuff, there's NGOs, the insurance, and there's a whole bunch of things. So it's like a multi-level problem where you have the state and the local government all engaged, and needless to say, there is the clinic. I don't know yet, and I cannot tell you yet, whether one is a more successful story than the other. What I can tell you is, knowing what I know of Children's Heartling and the 5 countries they're reaching out to, where they're trying to set up what we call Centers for Excellence, which is what the model they have currently. And Center for Excellence means the same idea that we did in Lanzhou, which is we want to build capacity, we want to build awareness in the community, and we want to empower the patient. This phenomenon of tops down or bottoms up is very prevalent. So this provides the continuum. So the whole idea here is that this is a way to inform how we approach, how do we select hospitals, and how do we develop them, okay? I'm not making any value judgment which is right or wrong. I don't even have the data that would suggest one is better than to tell you conclusively. But they seem to be both working. And the question is, under what conditions is really where I'm sitting right now. Okay. I must also tell you this issue of affordability, access, and awareness, or the issue of demand estimation, is not unique to, again, what I would call, say, an underdeveloped economy. This is as true a phenomenon in the US. All you have to change is the disease context. And one of the disease contexts that we have been quite engaged and involved with is this area of mental health or behavioral health. And in particular, we're looking at depression. And we now, at least now we are having that awareness. I mean, we know about that in a typical mental health issue, people who generally have it will deny it. Then there is the stigma, right? So we suppress it. What that does is there are some structural inequity in terms of our demand estimation. So if demand estimation is never right, then how can we ever come with supply side? And this is what we live and breathe, demand forecasting. But we know what are some of these structural inequities on the demand side. What we also know on the supply side, for example, is if you look at medical training and you people who are doing MBBS or MD, how much of their curriculum is devoted to psychiatry? And how many of those physicians aspire to become psychiatrists? And it's a very small number. It's almost a minuscule number. So when demand far exceeds supply, there's a vacuum, right? So what happens? So we have all kinds of people who are now become, from mental health counselors to a whole bunch. So it's a zoo out there. So the capacity is not a capacity that is very effective. It's a capacity that is fraught with all kinds of quality issues. And that's what makes this problem an interesting problem. And this problem is an epidemic in a university settings, especially in the ages of 18 to 22, where the numbers that I'm seeing is showing almost double-digit growth. Okay, so part of our, and this is another major grand challenge that I don't want to spare, but the same framework that we developed in Lanzhou for surgical is what we are effectively using here and building on it. And that just to give you a sense of the value of sometimes of the work sometimes we do, that how interesting, and without making any value judgment, some of these things can be leveraged to get some insight. So, so this is just to give you a flavor for the kind of work and the journey that is ongoing. The second sort of experience or journey that I want to share with you, which is still very much ongoing, really relates to this idea of how do we ensure just and equitable societies? And you might wonder, why? Why should we care about this, or let alone supply chain? To give you a very simple idea, that let me ground this. So this idea is, we are increasingly talking about designing and sustaining socially responsible supply chain. So again, I'm not claiming any authority about the definition, but as I read through this, it doesn't matter the healthcare setting or some other for-profit setting, I think it's fair enough to say what we're trying to do is to acknowledge that there are societal issues and concern that we better start incorporating and integrating in things that we call, like the SCORE model, the plan, source, make, deliver, and return. Medical recalls is a social problem. I mean, there's a social cost to it. So we cannot ignore it. So that's basically, kind of where we are coming from, is trying to begin to understand that how do we design and sustain socially responsible supply chain, and more so as we are globalizing our supply chain. So the context of this study is a paper that is forthcoming in manufacturing or service operations management. And as you can see from the title, this was motivated by some of the mishaps that happened in Bangladesh, right? The Rana Plaza tragedy, the fire. And it was not something that we had planned, but it occurred, and one thing led to another, and again, we have therefore been able to at least make some progress. So the basic idea here is that as we are globalizing our supply chain, we are also exposing them to man-made and natural disasters. And so there are risks. The risks are growing. And this is just an instance of it. I'm, again, not making no value judgment, but I'm telling you what the motivation of this study was. And sometimes you get lucky in terms of your research that you are able to access data, and the math goes through, and you keep making progress, and stuff happens. So the best things in life, as one would say, is unplanned for. So, but it was sufficiently powerful for some of the things we were doing, is to sort of beg this question, that, yeah, I mean, and Minnesota, Minneapolis is a retail town as much as a medical device town. It's already, there's a Target, the Best Buy, Amazon, its operations. There's a whole bunch of things going on. And so global sourcing is a very common phenomenon, okay? So it piqued our interest. And so we said, let's make, take one step at a time. So the more we learned about Bangladesh, I mean, we should have known. I'm a Bengali, so I stayed right next to Bangladesh, West Bengal. But what little did you realize is how consequential is this ready-made garment industry for Bangladesh's economy. How many people are employed? Who are those people, which is 80% women? What does that mean for the society? At a point with all the realities and the, of Bangladesh, this is probably one silver lining they have in terms of how they can support the sustenance of a lot of people's livelihood. So it caught our imagination, and we started looking into this. It's not surprising. The one thing that struck me, and I'm sure many of you can relate to, is one of the things that you don't hear about products coming out from Bangladesh is the issue of quality. A lot of times when you say we outsource, you have a quality problem. You give up cost, for quality, right? So this is, again, take it with some grain of salt. This gives you some flavor for what does it take, to produce one denim shirt. And again, it's not, the numbers are not important. What does give you a flavor of the order of magnitude difference? And I think that is reasonably steady and stable. So it's not surprising that a lot of the branded retailers have chosen to source from that part of the world or from Bangladesh. So the question that, was going on in my head at that point was that typically when you have a fiasco like this, then there is the reputation cost. So if there is a reputation cost, you get tainted as a branded retailer that you're sourcing from these kinds of countries. You're agnostic about the working condition, so you should cut and run, and that has happened, right? Yet there's a part of me that was also saying that, to date, I've not heard much about the quality issues of Bangladeshi products. Yes, these are ready-made garments. So what that says is, at least intuitively, that means that there are a lot of capable people out there, and which we know, people who know Dhakai sharis and all that. We know what kind of capabilities do exist. And for them, this is a good means of livelihood, and they are very capable. So if I'm a branded retailer, one line of argument would be that to say, hey, you know what? It's a lot easy to invest in, say, refurbishing a plant or even build a new plant or help build a new plant or help the factory owner rather than to create the capability to build the people, because to build people and capability is a whole different ballgame. And a lot of times when people move, is they believe that those capabilities are substitutable so they can easily replicate. So that was one of the motivators. There are two very competing arguments that the conventional wisdom would suggest the people will cut and run. Why would they not go to somewhere else, some other country and get. On the other hand, you say, hey, you know what? We are getting high quality products in high volume, reliable, replicable quantities, so why should we? So this is really what we started understanding, how can so can we improve or can we reduce the working condition risk? And if we do so what is the incentive for a factory owner in Bangladesh to invest in something that they have gone by with? There is no checks and balances, even if there's very little. There is no what we call Office of Safety, Health, and all that stuff. Not to anywhere close degree of monitoring, so you can get by. The only incentive is that if I do this, I will get more orders from these branded retailers. So in other words, there's a profit element to this. So I become more trustworthy, right? So we thought, well, we should be able to test, or let's try to test this hypothesis. So, effectively, to keep things very simple, there are three types of risks we were looking at, or we looked at, and these are all very obvious in light of the mishaps that occurred. The structural risk, buildings have collapsed. There's a fire risk, because fire did occur. Electrical risk, those are the common things, right? And so, effectively, this work was again done with two consortiums, not-for-profit consortiums. One is what you call the Accord, which is on fire and building safety in Bangladesh, which is a consortium of European retailers, and then Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety, which is essentially the consortium, again, a not-for-profit organization of the US or North American retailers. We got lucky. We got lucky for two reasons. One is we realized there's a whole host of inspection reports that is sitting available on public level website. People are putting it out there. What we also found we were lucky is that effectively when you look at what these questionnaires are involved, these questionnaires are very comparable. So in other words, we can merge the sample. So effectively, so there are two locations that we really fixated on. One is Dhaka, factories around Dhaka, and then there is those around Chittagong. And together we had about 1,600, real inspection reports that we thought, we could really count on. And as you can imagine, this is where some of the text mining, et cetera, becomes very relevant because we could mine this to get these kinds of information that we were seeking, and hopefully we can continue to keep doing this. Then we also got lucky in the sense that we realized that Bangladesh has certain industry association that has been collecting some data, and Bangladesh Post Office has amazing data. So we know now what we call the geospatial locations of each of these factories. And again, this is the data that we can leverage. And we have data which shows what kind of orders. We did not get enough data for the type of orders, but we know the number of orders. And again, we had 16, so there's a law of large numbers that I think so this is really the first take on this study. And this is really what we started to understand is, how does these risks affect trustworthiness? And then there was a perception that it seems like those factory owners who are large in size can get by with murder. That somehow that mitigates the perception of risk. They have resources. So even if they screw up, you're willing to give them back because you hope that they will up their capabilities. And so this is something you learn. This is a lot of tribal knowledge as one you would get. And so we had enough data, so we were able to estimate some of these, what we call the interaction models. And you can clearly see what we are trying to do. We're looking at trustworthiness as sort of the dependent variable and looking at the risk and the size as to the interaction variables. The main thing to identify, for the key insights is, again, the fact that, these fire and electrical risks do matter. And they matter compared to structural risk is because they're very observable. In fact, that has unleashed another line of work as to how do we make some of these inspections much more real-time and transparent. Because if you walk into a building, sometimes it's difficult to gauge the structural integrity of the building. And I think that's effectively the problem that we have. The conventional wisdom or some sort of the tribal knowledge about large factories is actually a true one. And I'm not making it right or wrong. It's an empirical reality that I think we did encounter. But perhaps one thing, having done this research, that really keeps me awake at night is the fact that will this consortium survive? This is a cutthroat industry. Competitors are coming together, right? Because this is a common good that they feel is worth investing. Will they continue to do that? Because if they don't in the short-term future, then all these things can be easily reversed. So the key here, in some sense, as a social experiment, is the survival of this consortium, because typically, when it comes to firms taking on some social responsibility, acts of social responsibility, generally, I would say there is a lot of window dressing, there's a lot of bumper stickers. But this is where we can see the real effect. Yet, it is an interesting social experiment that is in play, and the survival is something that, at least purely as a researcher, is of great interest, because now if you understand why people hang together, as I was saying, if you don't hang together, you'll be hanging separately, right? So this is a classic at that point. Is that going to be an enduring factor as to why people will hold together? We'll see. All right. So this is a body of work that is beginning to get even pre-publication enough what I call public press. And I'm just sharing this with you simply because it's a real team sport, because unless the communities comes together, this effort will never continue. And so to me, that's part of the experiment in play. So in closing, what I thought, and again, I want to come back to you, but before I say, what are some of the key takeaways? Because sometimes we do not acknowledge the things we do, and sometimes the fact that sometimes the things we do are actually valuable, especially when you work with people from other disciplines, right? And which has been part of my journey working on these grand challenges. People from medicine, engineering school, public policy, and these are genuine and true working relationships. So one of the things that is true is, in this space of grand challenges, what is needed more than ever before is this line of thinking, that we can think end-to-end, both intra and inter-organizational process of plan, source, make, deliver, that we think of processes and systems and how they interact, the people, process, technology, and the fact that we can think within and across organization country boundaries. This is what we do for a living, right? And this is badly in need. And that was one sort of interesting takeaway, is if only we can do this. They bring in, as Joe Diarani, who is the head of cardiovascular surgery at Mayo Clinic, a key medical volunteer, had read one of my papers, which is one of the first paper, actually was published in DSI, in Decision Sciences, said, hey, KK, I go and work when I go out to lunch or wherever. I work and take care of these kids. But for every kid I take care of, there's a whole bunch I leave behind. And that my heart breaks. Can you help work with us? Because it seems like you care about scale, you care about sustainability, you care about realism. And it was a very humbling moment for me and for Emily, who was then a doctoral student. And we said, wow, this is interesting. And then we co-authored another pediatric cardiac surgery, there's a medical journal. And then we said, yes, we can be complementary. And that's really what I want to leave you with, is that I think that some things that we do lend themselves in very complementary ways to other disciplines to address some of these grand challenges. The fact that we care about things like reliability, the fact that we care of responsiveness, the fact that we care of resilience, both in terms of the unforeseen demand, the fact that we care about being socially and environmentally responsible, they all are very relevant. We think of all of them actually together. There's very few disciplines that do what we do. And so it was, again, a gratifying moment to say, time and time again, and not after a couple of years, that, there is something. And so this opportunity was an opportunity to also reflect of how things have happened. The other thing is, we do think end-to-end, and increasingly so. We conceptualize and operationalize end-to-end. We are increasingly thinking about whether it's mechanism design or otherwise. We're thinking about win-win-win proposition. How can trading partners or partners share the risk, share the reward, share the information, the proverbial bullwhip effect, etc. And we do straddle between what I call the forest and the trees. We strategize, we execute. That's the mantra for us who do supply chain and operations. And we do so informed by data, but certainly not limited. So, and the most interesting thing is, we have the data, right? So we have the data in all its 4 V's. And data is coming like tsunami to us. With IoT technologies and other mechanisms, I think even the most difficult is becoming a tackleable problem, as we shared within Gansu province, that even when we get all these reams of qualitative data, we can separate the wheat from the chaff. We can separate the signal from the noise. And we have used things like signal detection theory. And so that plays to our advantage. There are non-traditional sources that we can now leverage in more ways than one. And the fact is, yes, this is also an opportunity for some methodological advances. How do we deal with some unstructured data, missing data, and noisy data? And so some of the work I would have never done had we not encountered these problems. And it was not problem for problem's sake. It was all geared towards something that we could see, feel, and touch, and realize, wow, we cannot just walk by and do nothing about it. Increasingly, we can access data, we can record data, we can store data, we can share data, we can analyze in ways we have never been able to do before. So I think all this plays to our advantage to bring to bear our collective competencies to choose what we want to do by way of grand challenges. And so all I would like to share saying is that even our, what I would call the quiver of data analytic methods, we were typically thought of people who did operations research, but we are doing statistics, we are doing psychometrics, we are doing econometrics, we are dabbling into grounded theory methods, doing all kinds of qualitative analysis, we are doing theory. And machine learning, we are getting into both supervised, unsupervised learning. You're tackling a lot of these. These are all part of the things that we are doing. The difference is we just don't do the business analytics, we also apply it to some of the problems which are consequent. And finally, our computation is becoming increasingly what I would call affordable and friendly. So with that, I would sort of close by saying, what is your moonshot, right? That's the question I posed with you. And all I can say from my own standpoint, again, this has been a shot in the arm for me. The journey is where the joy is. The impact is fulfilling. It's a team sport, so it's fun. So thank you. I don't know what you want to have questions. Are you pretty much out of time?
I think maybe you should have
I know there are more important things to follow, so I don't want to stand.
I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine.
We take liberty to ask questions if you have.
Yeah, and then maybe about 5 minutes of question before.
Yeah, because I know there's more important things hereafter, so I don't want to stand between. Yeah, but I think yeah, go ahead.
Can you roll the mic here, please?
Yeah, sure. Speak loudly.
Sure.
Go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
So you talked about risk, people buy risk and all that. And you also talked about how long it will continue. Just a thought came to mind.
Sure.
This risk called distrust risk, which I think we could have distrust risk.
Okay.
And that is something which provides them in a non-visual way. That may include empathy, trust,
Absolutely.
sense of belonging, compassion. And I think if that risk is explicitly mentioned and measured to different degrees at different point of time, this framework could become stronger.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think your point is because, as one would say, we can have all the technology we want. That does not mean we'll share private information, right? So we'll continue to have the bullwhip effect. We just automated it, right? So we need trust before we get into technology. And so private information, and that's effectively what you're saying. And I think the point is well taken. My hope is, this will be something that, in some sense, this is the standard unobservable, right? We know that it's happening. The question is it something we can actually test methodologically, and that we have done. But having said that, to get to that would be absolutely the ideal thing. Even, the measures of, there's a debate on trust and trustworthiness. There's two different things. But your point is very well taken because there's an inherent risk associated with it. And right now, we are not tackling the trust risk because it's so basic. Because people can get by. And people have been habituated to get by. Why would you change behavior? You can get by with fire. What happened to those factory owners? Not a whole lot. So no, the point, yes?
I think one of the things, particularly when we deal with the outsourcing into the international arena, we are trading off one kind of a risk with another kind of a risk.
Sure.
If we do it ourselves, we have an operational risk.
Right.
If we outsource, we have a strategic risk. So when you're looking at the structural risk and the fire risk and all that, do you take into account that when we have this thing, how do I trade off and how much trade-off is good for me from the operational risk to the strategic risk?
No, your point is very well taken. And here is what I would want to distinguish. We know that a lot of things are coming back, right? So for a whole bunch of reasons, control, logistics costs, energy costs, people are bringing back. This is not where this is happening, right? At least in this particular case, it's like, is it an irreversible problem or reversible problem, right? So this is in some ways, at least the data to date would not. So I mean, I beg this question to a lot of our retailer executives to say, okay, just for the sake of argument, some of these things were coinciding at the time when we were coming out of economic recession, right? So, okay, if you get the orders, you're seeing the orders coming from the consumers. Can you do it here in the Twin Cities? It's a capability issue? No, because people have moved along, right? And that is a very common phenomenon. In fact, there's a whole interview that I was involved with, because the government of Minnesota, our governor had this called Right Skills Now program, which basically means we have some immigrant population, like, they need jobs. Can we get them very quickly up to speed so that we can ramp up? We could not. And so effectively, your point is well taken, specifically in a lot of places like software, where we're saying from offshore to not shore. Not shore means Duluth, basically upstate Minnesota. And that's happening, right? But at the same time, this particular, at least the underlying assumption in this study is it's gone out there. Let's improve. And there are a lot of social benefits because to this, and it's a good reason. And the things that I did not get into is the fact that it's well established in some sociology literature and otherwise that when women are in the workforce, the society is a lot more, they are the breadwinner, the society is much more stable. The question is, can we make sure that the walls and the roof under which they're working is...
But even in the capacity building, this could be the same thing, whether I build my capacity myself and whether I build the capacity outside or use the capacity outside.
Right.
That is, again, a risk. One risk I have capacity building, other risk I have in using the capacity from outside.
Right. And the thing that, at least this is just a purely empirical observation, that right now, I don't see much of, what I call ownership of these branded retailers.
Yes.
Right? So, for example, there's a class of work we did, especially with the doctoral student, Anant Mishra. And so we basically had this 2x2 matrix, which is crossing firm boundaries and country boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. So you think of 3M going from the Twin Cities to Bangalore, it's still 3M, right? Versus, spreading across. So we are very mindful of that reality right now in the context of this industry sector. And that's why social responsibility is somewhat more salient, is the train has left the station. I think there's an acknowledgement, right? The question is the commitment going to stay? Because that has much larger implication in terms of how can we get competitors pool their resources together. You would otherwise compete for some social and common good. And that is common across a bunch of different industry sectors. Thank you. That's a great question.
One last question.
How do we do research that would have policy level implications? I think these are some of the issues that we have had since a long time, but it's being addressed right now. But how do we influence the government and regulatory bodies?
Well, the proof of the pudding is in showing the results, right? So, and that's the approach we have taken. So there are two ways I will approach and answer your question. One is we as a field, and the good news is we as a field have warmed up to acknowledge that there are departments of industry and public policy, whether it's the POMS Journal or even Susan Helper is heading up one in GOM. So there is a broad-based acknowledgement. So there is appetite for doing this kind of work and establishing yourself as a very eminent scholar. And there are people, so there are outlets, there are avenues. I think the good news is our discipline has warmed up to it. Having said that, then I would also venture to say we are doing some work ourselves. I didn't get into this. For example, one of the studies that we just got presented in Indian School of Business just in last week, is what we call a set-aside policy. Set-aside policy means that you set aside some of your government contracts to small contractors. And the intent here is to give them business so that you can grow that contractual, And it's really an equal access issue. And that we have in India, except that now we have some data. That's a very common phenomenon. The good news is, in that body of work, is you have data in ways that you were never available, because these are publicly available data. So what I would submit to you is the following, and we have at least now 2 papers that are in fairly advanced stages, which looks at the issues of the federal government and the implications. So there is data available, and so you just have to access the data. The one nice thing is that once the data gets published, work gets published, good work never gets unnoticed. And the good news about our discipline right now is we have avenues. So this is not some esoteric work that we say, oh, you are doing it. I think there is an appetite for people. So the federal government, the good news also is, if you look at United Nations, some of the World Food Program, supply chain is in the vocabulary. You will, all the movement of exodus of people across continents, United Nations, humanitarian, and then refugee. They all talk about supply chains right now. So the work has real implications. We take that work from being a white paper to a research paper with actionable results. So it's in some ways what happens in medicine or everywhere else. So I think that is what I would leave you with, is that there's both appetite in the discipline, and there is data which I think we can do pretty serious work, actually. I had one more question.
Sir, how these big players are able to manage the technology transfer risk? Like the duplicacy of products will also be there. Like when they are outsourcing the products, so how they are managing duplicacy and all these things?
Again, excellent point. Obviously, but basically, what you're talking of, the issues of piracy, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean that. So there are 2 ways to, you're tackling it. And one is, we have to obviously stay up the game. I mean, so that's why some of these, RFID technologies are coming on. They're not still quite economically viable, but all these unique identification codes gets you to that point. There is also effort that I can tell you that is going on, is there's a vacuum out there, because this problem of piracy is pretty serious. It's a traceability issue. It does not matter the tracing, whether your Rolex watch is a real Rolex, or or some of the medicine has the ingredients. And there are some very interesting, and I know of at least one of the companies in the Twin Cities who are developing interesting technologies to both sense and analyze data, so that the red flag goes up, like a CPFR, right? So there's some anomalies, you pick that up. And that's happening almost on a real-time basis. So I think that work is in progress.
The main point is, we are outsourcing to the company, and that company is taking the technology, and that company starts manufacturing the same product, right? Because they have same machines, they start producing the same quality product. How they are managing that technology transfer risk, garment industries?
No, I think the point, that's the question that, what's your name? Sridevi. This is exactly one of the issues that you are currently faced in a lot of China-US trade, right? Basically, what we are beginning to see is we are losing a lot of the intellectual property, claims, right? I mean, that's exactly what's going on, except that it's with the blessings of the government. Now, these are things that have to be looked into. I mean, honestly, I have not had a chance, but we are aware of some of these things. All I can say is the point is very well taken, but it requires, at least in this particular case, clearly this is where, again, I should not be saying this, coming from the US, we should celebrate World Trade Organization, not try to get rid of it. That's where some of these, how the countries come together in setting up the rules of engagement, so that there is a fair share, an equitable share of the value is very relevant. Well above my pay grade. That's all I can say right now. But the point is absolutely well taken. And this is where I think, what we do has public policy implications.
That's right. Well, you know, I'm sure we have a lot of questions. I just want to take a quick moment to thank Professor Sinha for such an insightful talk. Actually, I just wanted to mention one thing. I feel like his talk sets the stage for rest of the conference. I want to point out a couple of sessions for you on the grand challenge scheme of things that Professor Sinha pointed out to us. On tomorrow, we have a session on gender inclusion, okay, in decision sciences. We also have a session on disability inclusion, financial inclusion, and health inclusion. We are talking about that in a panel, so please consider participating in that panel. The speaker on the last day is going to talk about climate change in India. She has a book called Climate Solution, and she's going to talk about how you know, water-related issues, you know, inclusion-related issues in the context of that. So I really feel like Professor Sinha did us a great service in trying to set up what the big challenges are, and hopefully, you know, there's going to be some conversation on that line. So with that, I'm going to have our student group felicitate Dr. Sinha here, and thank you very much.
I would like to request Dr. Sajeev George to present the memento to Dr. K.K. Sinha.